Hello and welcome to Memo's Weekly Review. I'm your host, Nasim Ahmed, and as always, I'm joined by my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani, to unpack the biggest stories of the week. Hi, Mouin, how are you doing?
Hello, Nasim. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Likewise. So this week, we'll be starting with Gaza, the latest from the besieged enclave, more than a week into the ceasefire agreement. And then we'll move to the West Bank, where we unpack the launch of what Israel is calling Operation Iron Wall, which is provocatively named after Zeev Jabotinsky, who is you could say, an inspiration for most of the far-right extremists in Israel. And then we'll move to Trump's proposal, number of proposals, but mainly we want to look at his plan to, let's admit, to ethnically cleanse Palestinians into Jordan and Egypt. Is just another round of ethnic cleansing? Is this plan serious, or should we take it seriously? Given that before the 7 October, following the 7 October attack, Blinken tried something similar. And then we'll look at some of the stories of crackdown on pro-Palestinian activism in Harvard University, also in Switzerland, where Ali Abu Ni'ma, who is I think he's the director, executive director of Electronic Intifada. He was arrested. And also in Australia, there's an interesting case of the Australian Prime Minister coming out and saying that um, the anti-Semitism attacks have been orchestrated from abroad by people who are being paid to carry out anti-Semitic attacks. So what does that all mean? But as I said, let's begin with Gaza. We've seen a lot of footage coming out. Over the week, we also saw Israel opening fire, refusing to allow Palestinians to return to northern Gaza. Tens of thousands of Palestinians were also stranded in the Netzarim Corridor. So just get your thoughts on the ceasefire deal, how it's holding up, if Israel is violating the ceasefire deal any shape or form.
Well, clearly, Israel is seeking to delay the implementation of this agreement as long as possible because I think for Israel there were two key issues. The first is preventing the return of displaced Palestinians to the northern Gaza Strip, and secondly, derailing the agreement before it reaches its second stage in the next few weeks. That's something that's still being negotiated. So, what Israel did during the past week, after Hamas released, or after the Palestinians released three of the soldiers in their custody, Israel claimed that in fact there was another woman who was a civilian and not a soldier, and that according to the agreement, she should have been released first. And on that basis, they were going to prevent Palestinians from heading north. And additionally, they were not going to begin their withdrawal from the so-called Netzarim Corridor, this corridor within the Gaza Strip that Israel has occupied and whose purpose is to bisect the Gaza Strip. Um, so what happened subsequently is Islamic Jihad, which is holding this woman, responded and said that although Islamic Jihad considers her a soldier, not only will she be released on Thursday, but two other soldiers in the custody of the Palestinians, two other soldier captives, will also be released. That is before the regular Saturday-Sunday exchange of captives between Israel and the Palestinians. And on that basis, Israel then demanded, well, according to the agreement, Israel is supposed to get a list of, or at least details on the remaining captives, Israeli captives, during the first phase of the agreement, with an indication of which are dead and which are still alive. And that list was provided, or those details were provided to Israel through the mediators as well. And apparently, it turned out that significantly more of these captives are alive than had been assumed by Israel and all its stenographers in the Israeli and international media. I think the current available statistics are that 19 are alive and 8 are dead. And Israel was really left with no further excuse or pretext to delay or postpone. I suspect there may have been some American and Egyptian pressure involved in this as well. The result is that beginning on Monday morning, we saw these extraordinary and extraordinarily moving, I should add, scenes of thousands and thousands and thousands of Palestinians making the trek back from the central Gaza Strip and the southern Gaza Strip, the Mawasi area, Deir al-Balah, where many of them have been stuck for a year or longer, going back to the northern Gaza Strip, to what they know is the rubble of their former homes, the systematically destroyed communities that used to be theirs. It's not like they have no idea what they're going back to. They know there's absolutely nothing left there except perhaps some remaining relatives and the remains of others under the rubble. Nevertheless, I think in an extraordinary act of collective will, these Palestinians have begun streaming through the Netzarim Corridor, which, let's not forget, was supposed to be a permanently occupied Israeli corridor to bisect the Gaza Strip, into the northern Gaza Strip, which was supposed to be thoroughly and permanently ethnically cleansed, according to the general's plan. It's reminiscent, in fact, of similar scenes we saw in southern Lebanon, first in 2000 and then again in 2006, where immediately upon the going into force of a ceasefire, tens of thousands of Lebanese civilians streamed into their villages and homes in order to prevent Israel from creating a permanent buffer zone that would be free of these communities and these residents. So I think, I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say that when Israel's obituary is eventually written, and I believe that it will eventually be written, that these extraordinary scenes that we've seen in the Gaza Strip this morning will be seen as an important turning point in that story, because of course Israel is all about maximum land with minimum Arabs. It's all about dispossessing Palestinians and their forcible expulsion or transfer. And what we've seen now is the exact opposite dynamic. And it's really an act of collective popular will. This was never supposed to happen. Yes, new residents were supposed to go into the northern Gaza Strip, but they were supposed to be radical Jewish settlers implementing the agenda of the Israeli government, and particularly of Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben Gvir. Now we're seeing the exact opposite. I think this represents a strategic failure for Israel, which has not only failed to achieve any of its proclaimed objectives, but now has proven unable to even achieve any of its unstated objectives, meaning the ethnic cleansing of at least part of the Gaza Strip, the permanent, indefinite, if you will, occupation of this corridor that bisects the Gaza Strip, the general's plan, and all the rest of it. As of today, the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip, in whole or in part, is no longer on the agenda, regardless of what any Israeli says, and regardless of what their bosses in Washington think or say.
Yeah, we'll get to that. I mean, is it off the table given what Trump has said? I'll get your thoughts on that afterwards. And of course, we are recording this on Monday, and I think we're all watching the tens of thousands of Palestinians returning back to northern Gaza. If nothing else, it is, as you mentioned, it's an act of defiance, and it probably is um, an answer to Trump's proposal in the most clearest way. So we'll get to that. But before I do that, I want to get some of you, I mean, your thoughts on the actual exchange of the hostages itself. Just the optics of what Hamas and Islamic Jihad did, and also the the way the hostages look and how they perceive. Because if you remember, there was a huge campaign to make it look like Hamas is going to do all kinds of horrific things to the hostages, and Israeli propagandists conjured up all kinds of images to justify the genocide in Gaza. And that seems to me, anyway, a stark contrast to how they actually have appeared, looking healthy. Not to say they didn't feel they weren't subjugated to any harms or whatever, but even the Jerusalem Post itself has recognized this, and it had an article just the other day saying Hamas altered hostages' appearance before their release. So even they can't believe it. And it goes on to say that despite nearly starving the hostages, Hamas used special techniques to make them look healthier
Yeah.
and more energetic.
Yes,
I
it's
mean, it
called feeding them.
sounds unbelievable, but that's the kind of headline which the
Mm,
Jerusalem Post
mm.
is employing to explain exactly what's going on. They don't appear to be victims of the kind of suffering and the kind of dehumanization which they've been propagandizing for the last 15 months.
Yeah, it's incredible. Reading the accounts that have been emerging from Israel and its stenographers in the international media and its flunkies on social media and so on. For example, these women who were released this week have, supposed to have been gang raped 24/7 for 15 months, pregnant with their second child. But none of that appears to be true. Let me start by saying there are clear international standards regarding the treatment of both military captives and civilian hostages. And Hamas is under an absolute obligation to respect those standards, irrespective of how Israel treats its Palestinian captives and hostages. So I want to get that clear. And it's quite obvious that those standards have not been met by either party during the past 15 months. Having said that, it's quite clear. I mean, it doesn't really take a degree in rocket science to understand that it was in Hamas's interests to keep these captives alive, given that they hope to exchange them for the freedom of Palestinian captives held by Israel. And obviously, a live hostage has a much greater value in such an exchange than a corpse. Um, Secondly, yes, those who were released did not seem traumatized and disoriented and gaunt and on the verge of starvation in any way comparable to the Palestinians that are being released by Israel. And so, of course, the explanation is that there was some secret sauce or secret elements used to make them look healthy. Well, yes, it's called food. It's called water. It's called nutrition. I mean, I'm very happy, as I think everyone would be, that they were not in their shoes of these people during the past 15 months. But to compare their conditions of detention to that of the Palestinians, really, I mean, the main threat to both was, in fact, Israel and not the Palestinians. The main threat to those being held in the Gaza Strip was, of course, that they would be obliterated by a massive bomb, a U.S. bomb dropped by the Israeli Air Force or a tank shell. The main threat in Israel, where dozens have been tortured to death, is that you would be, gang raped, or tortured to death, or starved to death. And there have been literally dozens of killings in Israeli custody just during the past 15 months. So to say that there is somehow a comparison. Usually people are outraged. How dare you compare Hamas to Israel? Well, yes, how dare you compare Israel and Hamas, given what we absolutely incontrovertibly know about conditions in custody, including rape, including gang rape, including torturing people to death, including severe malnutrition, including psychological torture, and all the rest of it. Yes, we should say, how dare you compare the two?
I want to use, before going to the West Bank, I think it's best for us to have the conversation about Trump's announcements last week. I want to do that because do you think if all the hostages are released, Hamas will, of course, have lost leverage, and that may open up the possibility of the Americans and the Israelis being able to do whatever they want and employ even more violence, even more, if that's possible, to actually do what they've always wanted to, which is to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from Gaza. And Trump seems to be now on board with that. He made that announcement on Air Force One, and he said that he's speaking with the Jordanians and the Egyptians for Palestinians to be relocated. These are the words he used, but of course we know what that means. It means, of course, ethnically cleansing the Palestinians from Gaza. So how realistic is that proposal? And do you think, given that if the hostages are all released, that Hamas gives up some form of leverage and therefore is more prone to pressure from Washington and the region?
Excuse me. Look, there's very little that either the Israelis or the Americans can do to the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, to Hamas and the other Palestinian movements, for that matter, that they haven't already done. What are they going to threaten them with? 2,000-pound bombs? A general's plan in the northern Gaza Strip? Uh, um, declaring a siege on the population of the Gaza Strip. There's very little that, perhaps they could saturate the Gaza Strip with chemical or biological or nuclear weapons. But apart from that, when you've committed genocide for over a year, what exactly is the threat to the Palestinians of something that you haven't done already? I think there was a real risk of the mass forcible displacement of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, and that risk was at its height in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, where Israeli leaders were openly stating this as an initiative, as an objective. The Americans, under the unlamented Biden and Blinken, openly embraced this initiative. And in fact, Blinken went on a tour of Arab capitals to sell this proposal and get Arab support for it. I mean, that's how idiotic this guy is. He actually went to sell the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip to Arab governments, expecting them to cooperate, not understanding that any punitive measures that would be undertaken by Washington to those who refuse to cooperate would pale by comparison with the punitive measures that would be unleashed on any leader that participated on this by their own people. But anyway, the point is that Blinken was basically shooed away, including by America's closest Arab client regimes when he made this proposal. And I think what the extraordinary scenes that we've seen this Monday of these tens of thousands and eventually hundreds of thousands of Palestinians returning to the northern Gaza Strip is kind of the final word on this issue. Yes, Trump can say what he wants, and apparently he has spoken with both the Jordanian monarch and the Egyptian president about this. Both of them, in no uncertain terms, have told him this is a non-starter. And it's unclear even to what extent Trump is serious about this. You know, maybe one of his more radical cabinet members or some funder whispered into his ear that this would be a great idea and he should propose it to the Egyptians and the Jordanians, and he did, and now he has his response. The problem with Trump is he's so erratic and unpredictable and prone to so many statements that can stand in direct contradiction with each other, that it's really impossible to sift between serious and unserious. So he's made his proposal, he's tried to market it, and it been rebuffed in no uncertain terms. Uh, Perhaps even more importantly, the reality on the ground is in the exact opposite direction. People are forcing their way back into the northern Gaza Strip rather than being forced out of the Gaza Strip. And we'll have to see in the coming weeks and months if the Trump administration or elements of it either try to revive this proposal in a serious manner or give the Israelis authorization to do so themselves.
I mean, let's talk a little bit about Jordan and Egypt as well. We've spoken a few shows back that even autocrats and dictators, they have to listen to their public once in a while. And this issue is probably one of the most triggering issue in the Middle East, not least in Egypt and Jordan. So given that's the context, there was another announcement Trump made last week, which is to suspend all foreign aid for 90 days. This is part of his America First agenda, but the country he did not, lift suspend aid from is Israel and Egypt and Jordan. And Egypt and Jordan, because of course both have a treaty with
Can I just
Israel.
interrupt to say I know Egypt is exempt. I didn't see that Jordan was also exempt.
From what I read, I think Jordan was also
I
exempt
see.
from that.
Mm.
Again, that's because of Israel, because
Yeah.
both of them have a peace treaty with Israel, and therefore,
Mm.
this is another guarantee for Israel's safety and security, as
Mm.
Trump sees it. So the question then is, if does try to pressure both countries, do you think the fact that they have a peace treaty that gives them more leverage over Israel and the US, or is it the other way around? Do you think it gives them less of a leverage? Because the Egyptians and the Jordanians can say, look, you want to pressure us, we cannot do anything because our population are against this. And if you push us too much, we'll have to withdraw from the treaty. So that's a leverage they can use. So does that give them a bit more of a sway in any kind of discussion that may take place in the future? I know we're
Mm.
speculating a lot of things, but given how erratic Trump is, given the kind of people he's surrounded himself with, one of whom we will discuss later on, they don't even recognize the Palestinians. So there is a possibility Trump could try and pressure both countries, and they may want to use this as a leverage, the treaty
Mm.
with Israel.
Well, yes, but it works both ways. You're entirely correct, I think, to see U.S. aid and assistance to key Arab states like uh, Jordan, like Egypt, like to a lesser extent Lebanon, as part and parcel of U.S. aid and assistance to Israel. It should be seen in that framework. Nevertheless, these Arab governments are also extraordinarily dependent on this aid and assistance and the political support that it signifies, and would be in a real pickle without it. getting back to your question, it also works both ways. I mean, the U.S. can threaten these leaders and these governments with significant consequences, not only cutting aid, but also, now that Trump is back, imposing tariffs, canceling various trade agreements, and so on. Um, and and in response, yes, they could threaten to downgrade or suspend or even cancel their agreements with Israel. Though I think it's extremely unlikely because if you look, for example, at Egypt and Jordan, um, uh, their peace treaties with Israel are not only central to Israel's security, but have become increasingly important to regime security in these countries as well. But that's not what I think is the main issue. The main issue is that these leaders understand that the ethnic cleansing of Palestine is not going to make the issue go away. I mean, you look at Jordan. Jordan in 1948 was accused of colluding with the Zionist movement during the partition. Well, its monarch was assassinated. His successor, or rather his successor's successor, um, almost lost power to a popular movement in the country, represented by a prime minister he had to appoint. Had to be saved by British troops when their cousins in Iraq were overthrown in 1958, and ultimately Jordan became the most important base for Palestinian guerrilla movements, particularly after 1967. And in 1970, this resulted in a civil war in Jordan between Jordan and the PLO that posed a very significant risk to the survival of the Jordanian monarchy. In other words, um, uh, these countries have absolutely no intention of importing a crisis created by Israel and allowing Israel to export that crisis to these Arab states and make them problems for others at the Palestinians' expense, because it's not like the Palestinian struggle will go away simply by expelling Palestinians. There's decades of historical experience to suggest otherwise.
Yeah, I think to add to that, let's just assume that the Palestinians are pushed out to Jordan and Egypt. It doesn't mean the issue goes away. They will continue to resist Israeli
From Jordan
occupation
and
from
Egypt.
Jordan, which means, if anything, that jeopardizes the treaty with Egypt and Jordan, because now you're not no longer dealing with the Palestinians, you're dealing with Egypt, a state in whose borders Palestinians are carrying out resistance attacks, and from Jordan. So I think if Trump really thinks this through, he'll realize he'll probably create more of a problem, not with the Palestinians themselves, but with surrounding countries, which is an even bigger issue to consider. Let's move to. Sorry, did you want to add? Say,
Well, I just want to say, I mean, let's also not ignore potentially the trial balloon aspect of this. You float an idea, you see if it lands in fertile soil or not. If it does, and the pushback is not persuasive, then you go a step further. If you're cut off at the root, then you go and try a different idea. So at this stage, I certainly wouldn't take this initiative more seriously than the very serious and very sincere effort by the Biden administration to midwife the mass expulsion of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip in late 2023.
you talk about trial balloon. I think we need. This is a good moment to turn our attention to the West Bank. It looks like Israel is shifting its genocide to the West Bank. And Gaza was a trial balloon. Looking at the international response, Israel has been funded and supported by the US and all its Western allies. And if I was an Israeli, I'd be thinking, I can do the same in the West Bank. And that's exactly what seems to be happening in the West Bank. They've launched an operation called Operation Iron Wall, which I think is significant because the name is from an essay written by Jabotinsky in 1923, and he is I would say, the predecessor or ideologically to all the extreme settlers, Netanyahu, and the far right extremists like Smotrich and Ben Gvir. This is the guy they look up to. So um, they're engaged in ethnic cleansing in the West Bank in an operation called Operation Iron Wall. What do you make of the fact that they use such terminology? And also, do you actually think they are now shifting, the Israelis are shifting to the West Bank, having trialed a genocide in Gaza?
Mm. Well, just on Jabotinsky, before the establishment of the State of Israel, you had two main trends within the Zionist movement. You had what was known as labor Zionism, which effectively ruled Israel as a one-party state from 1948 to 1977. And then you have what's called revisionist Zionism. The movement was established by Ze'ev Jabotinsky. His heirs subsequently founded the Herut Party, which morphed into the Likud coalition and has been either in power or contesting it from 1977 to the present day. Now, Jabotinsky, I think, was a much more honest and forthright colonialist than his rivals in the labor Zionist movement. In his well-known essay, "The Iron Wall," to which you refer it, I believe it was published in 1929. He made the argument that these Arabs, as he called them, um, are not just going to kind of roll over and play dead. They're on their own land, and there is no way that they are going to accept seeing their country transformed into a Jewish exclusivist supremacist state. Um, the Arabs, as Jabotinsky put it, will only will only accept the Jewish supremacy in Palestine when they believe that not only is Israel powerful, but that the mere hope of challenging it no longer exists, and that is the Iron Wall. It's a political more than a physical barrier. It's the extinct only when hope of challenging the Jewish state is extinguished can that Jewish state be secure. Now, if this sounds a bit like fascist rhetoric, well, the reason is that Jabotinsky and his revisionist Zionist movement actually took direct inspiration for their establishment from European fascism, specifically from Benito Mussolini's Italy. That was the role model and inspiration for Jabotinsky and revisionist Zionism. Now, um, it morphed into what we now know as the Likud party. And I believe that Netanyahu's father was at one point an associate or a personal assistant to Jabotinsky, if I'm not mistaken. But these other characters who you're mentioning, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, they come from a different tradition, which is so far off the scale. They make the Likud and or at least the revisionist Zionists seem like, social democrats. So, having said that, so the name Iron Wall is quite telling for what's now happening in the West Bank. Um, it's a initiative to extinguish not only resistance, but to extinguish hope. That is a strategic objective here. And so we see not only kind of the regular incursions and attempts to assassinate militants and carry out mass arrests and so on. But now increasingly also, as we've seen in the Gaza Strip, the deliberate and increasingly systematic destruction of infrastructure and so on, um, uh, prohibition of medical care, siege of hospitals. And in addition, now Israel has confirmed that UNRWA will be prohibited from operating in the West Bank, I believe, as of the 29th of January. And
That's right.
here I think is an important distinction between Israel and similar states. Unlike the United States or apartheid South Africa, or let's say India in Kashmir, um, Israel is extraordinarily dependent on foreign support and knows it is. And rather than just going in and kicking the door in, and doing as it pleases when it launches these important new initiatives, it always starts with gradual steps. Um, it knocks on the door, waits to see the reaction from the other side. Um, if it's okay, it will then kind of, pick the lock and open the door a bit. If there's no solid resistance, then it'll swing the door wide open. And with what Israel is doing now with UNRWA is precisely that. Um, if it can get away with banning the most important international humanitarian agency and development agency that operates in the West Bank, and one that is a United Nations agency and funded by the international community, no less. Well, if the Europeans suffice with making their usual statements about the importance of this and the importance of that and do nothing, and the Americans encourage Israel to continue going its merry way, well, then Israel understands that it can do as it pleases and begin a much more concerted campaign to starve Palestinians in the West Bank of essential services. Along the lines of what it has been doing in the Gaza Strip. So we need to see this not only as an initiative with a clearly defined objective, but also as a litmus test, as an Israeli litmus test for the international community. Will you or will you not allow us to obliterate UNRWA in the West Bank? Because if you won't, then we're going to have to be forced to allow it to restore its services. And if you look the other way and suffice with meaningless anodyne statements, then we know that since we've gone after this very big fish, we can easily now go after the smaller fish. It's exactly as we saw with the medical sector in the hospital. You bomb one hospital, and if you manage to sow enough doubt and confusion that everyone starts saying, actually, it was a misfired Palestinian rocket, not an Israeli raid, well, then you know that you have effectively Western permission to eradicate the entire Palestinian medical sector.
Mm. Going back to Jabotinsky, I think that we should say that is the dominant strain of Zionism at the moment. The two strain you mentioned, the less genocidal, less fascistic one is the one that's has very little influence in Israel, and the dominant one is the Smotrich, is the Jabotinsky revisionist Zionism that has sway in Israeli politics. And one thing that's refreshing, I would say, about them is the fact that they will say things like, we are the colonizers and they are the colonized. And there has never been a period in human history where the colonizers, the colonized did not resist those who are occupying their land. Palestinian are colonized, we are occupying their land, and therefore it's right that they will resist, and we should be ready for that. And in the sense that we need to use the iron fist against the Palestinians. That's the narrative which I think the liberal Zionists tried to tone temper down, but I don't think they've succeeded. That's the most dominant strain that's in Israel at the moment. I wanted to now turn our attention to some of the stories about crackdown on pro-Palestinian activism, beginning with Harvard University, the arrest of Ali Abu Nirma in Switzerland, and also an interesting statement that was made by the Australian Prime Minister. Albanese, Anthony Albanese, who said that paid actors could be behind the anti-Semitic attacks. Um, there's been a number of cases over the past few years where paid actors were drawing swastikas, carrying out attacks against Jews in the hope of blaming pro-Palestinian activists. So that's been happening in the US and other places. There are many, many examples which you can find online. And here is a prime minister, Australian prime minister, who comes out and said that paid actors are doing this. And then there's a massive crackdown in Harvard University, where the university has adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism as part of a way to reconcile with the Jewish students. So if you remember, a year ago, there was a protest in Harvard. Many Jewish students complained about the pro-Palestinian activism. And as part of that reconciliation, the university will twin with an Israeli university, adopt the IHO definition. And the following day, having adopted the definition, they cancelled a class where Palestinians from Gaza was expected to give witness of what they experienced. But the university said that this is too one-sided. We cannot have an event where it's just Palestinians giving witness, and therefore the university cancelled that event. And of course, Ali Abu Nirma, who was arrested on Friday in Switzerland by Swiss police. He was there to give a speech in Zurich University, in Zurich that afternoon, on Saturday afternoon, I think. So there's a lot of things happening in terms of crackdown. It's not just one country. There seems to be a lot of things happening in a lot of countries. And I just want to just get your thoughts on whichever one you want to pick up on. Just get your thoughts on all of that.
Well, I think all three of these cases that you mentioned should be seen as part and parcel of an orchestrated global campaign by Western governments to suppress pro-Palestinian activism in their countries and by their citizens. It's indisputably clear as daylight what's going on. So let's take these cases one by one. Regarding Ali Abu Na'ma, the founder and executive director of the Electronic Intifada, a well-known website, what's telling in this is not only the obvious that this is an outrageous assault on not only free speech, but the criminalization of journalism. But what's telling to me also is that Abu Nama is in fact a U.S. citizen, and not only was he not denied entry to Switzerland, but he was permitted entry and not arrested until the following day. I think as he was about to give a talk in Zurich.
Zurich.
So it seems, the Swiss authorities have gone out of their way to make a spectacle of this, to make an example of Ali Abu Nama with a very clear message. We're doing this to an American citizen. So, if you think that if you're not an American or EU citizen, you think you can come to our country and criticize Israel, well, think again. And the I think as a prosecutor or something, or the person who ordered
That's right.
Wadama's arrest is apparently a well-known Israel flunky. There have been pictures all over internet and media of him speaking, in front of a massive Israeli flag. And the other telling thing is that, to the best of my knowledge, not a single mainstream news organization has made an issue out of this, just as they've looked the other way for the past 15 months while Palestinian journalists in the Gaza Strip have been murdered and summarily executed one after the other and pretending nothing to see here. So that's that case. The second one, Australia, I think Prime Minister Albanese's choice of words are quite telling. He spoke of foreign actors. Does that mean foreign parties, or does that mean foreign, or does that mean actors in the sense of people paid to perform a role that otherwise wouldn't be theirs? In other words, it seems to me that what he's saying is that foreign parties paid to stage anti-Semitic attacks rather than commit anti-Semitic attacks out of anti-Semitic motivations. In other words, what we're dealing here was kind of a false flag propaganda operation, which is not only disgusting but also extremely dangerous, because it's not like it's not as if the only anti-Semitic incidents that we're seeing are fake ones. There are very real anti-Semitic incidents, and in fact, they're rising. And now every Nazi and neo-Nazi and anti-Semite is going to be able to completely dismiss real anti-Semitism and say, "What do you mean? It's all staged. It's all paid actors." And so one really hopes that those responsible will not only be identified, but also held to account for their actions. And of course, purely speculating, but is it entirely out of the question that pro-Israeli figures could be involved in this? They have a long history of not only promoting anti-Semitism, but also staging anti-Semitic attacks for political purposes. Harvard, yes, Harvard has chosen to respond to the Gaza genocide by declaring its undying, ironclad solidarity and eternal love for the state that committed the genocide. Um, it's going to twin with an Israeli university. It's going to adopt Israel's preferred definition of anti-Semitism, which transforms criticism of Israel into racial hatred and subordinates anti-Semitism to anti-Zionism. And it's also now just canceled a session, I believe, at its medical school in which two speakers from the Gaza Strip, or who had been to the Gaza Strip, I'm not sure, we're going to speak about their experiences on the grounds that it's not balanced. And of course, this is entirely consistent because Harvard has never featured a survivor of the Holocaust without also bringing in at least one or two concentration camp guards in order to ensure balance of the event. It's so clear. Um, uh, Harvard is going all in on the Gaza genocide.
I mean, we should, I think, over the past year, Harvard did host Israeli soldiers. I don't think when they did that, they had a counterpart or Palestinian to give the counter narrative. So when it comes to the Palestinian narrative, no, we have to couch that within, we have to both side that discussion. But when it comes to the Israelis, yeah. So let's end now, though, with a question about Trump. The focus now is on Iran, and Trump has done a couple of things over the past week. I just want to get your thoughts on whether you think that shows that he probably isn't willing to do what the hawks and the neocons and the pro-Israeli flunkers, as you like to call them, are seeking, which is for Trump to invade Iran, or if not invade, provide the weapons and the means for Israel to carry out some form of a strike on Iran. So he revoked protection for Hook, Bolton, and Pompeo, three people who are key in his cabinet in the first term. All were extremely hawkish when it came to Iran. Bolton, as many would say, he never saw a war. He never liked, so this guy has always been seeking some form of regime change in the Middle East. And then you had Mike Pompeo, who was the Secretary of State, again, another Iran hawk. And he's basically revoked their protection. And many of the pro-Israeli flunkies, people like Barry Wise, they've actually come out and kind of condemned Trump for doing that, saying, these guys were in your office administration, and
Buyer's remorse.
yeah, but so what kind of signal does that send when he does that to people who are within his own administration,
Mm.
extremely hawkish when it comes to Iran, and
Yeah,
now they've been
very interesting.
pushed
Yeah,
aside?
very interesting. He's fired Brian Hook. You may recall that shortly after he fired John Bolton in his first term, when he was asked about it, he said, "Well, if it were up to John Bolton, we'd now be in World War VI." And he's
Mm.
revoked his security detail, as well as Pompeo, saying, these people have enough money to pay for it themselves. But look also at those he's been appointing. I unfortunately can't recall the names, but there's a appointment he's made in the Pentagon as well, that suggests a less belligerent line towards Iran. I think what's going on is that when Trump assumed office the first time around in 2017, there was a very clear alignment between the United States, Israel, and their Arab allies about taking a hostile attitude towards Iran, about promoting more pressure on Iran and seeking to further weaken it and isolate it regionally. And so they were all on board with Washington's unilateral renunciation of the Iranian nuclear agreement and replacing it with the policy of maximum pressure. That didn't work out so well. Iran is now much closer to developing a nuclear weapon, should it choose to do so. Um, and of course, Iran demonstrated that it has the capacity to attack extremely sensitive locations in Saudi Arabia, and that the United States is either unable or unwilling to do anything about it. And Israel is now increasingly seen by these Arab states not so much as a valued security partner, but as a regional pyromaniac that wants to set the entire region aflame. And so the difference between now and then is I believe that Trump is not committed to resuming this very belligerent policy towards Iran in his first term, and is open to an agreement with Iran under the right circumstances, and therefore wants these crazies out of the way. Arab states, I think, they've been in a process of détente with any normalization with Iran in recent years that appears to be continuing even as they see Iran weakened by recent events. That leaves Israel as the odd man out, demanding war with Iran, or more precisely, demanding an American war with Iran. And I don't think Trump is ready for that yet. My sense is that he may well be prepared to give genuine diplomacy a chance. You may recall that during his first term, once the U.S. renounced the nuclear agreement, Iran refused to have any discussions. That may be different this time around. We'll have to wait and see.
Mm.
But
And
if
as
I
you mentioned,
may,
if it,
the reason we're in this situation again is because the Biden administration here again simply refused to rejoin the nuclear agreement. The Biden administration did not reverse a single one of the first Trump administration's Middle East policies. And that's why we're having this discussion now.
Mm. And as you mentioned, if he genuinely is seeking the Nobel Peace Prize, then I'm sure he's smart enough to know he's not going to get that if he starts wages a war on Iran. I think and what is telling for me is many of his mega base are semi-pleased with the stances taken, except on Palestine. And they do say that. They say, on Palestine, he just seems off kilter. His messaging on everything else is fine, but on Palestine, it's not consistent. And you see that with some of the other appointments he made, especially with someone like Elisa Stefanik, who's Trump's pick for U.S. ambassador. In her hearing last week, she said that, she was asked by a Democrat member of Congress, do you believe Israel has a right to the West Bank, biblical right to the West Bank? And she said, yes, Israel has a biblical right to the West Bank.
Yeah.
And then she could not even say that Palestinians have a right to self-determination. She refused to acknowledge that fact. So on Palestine, he just seems really off kilter, but on other issues, some of his mega base are very pleased with the stances taken of America
And of
first.
course, what religious extremism, that's a problem in the Middle East, not the United States.
Yeah. So Boyd, as ever, it's a pleasure listening to your thoughts. That was my
Likewise,
guest,
Nasim. Thank you very
Mouin
much.
Rabbani, for our weekly review show with me, Nasim Ahmed. See you all next week. Bye-bye.